The wind did not merely blow across the high plains of Wyoming in the late 1870s. It scoured. It carried the grit of 3 dried-up counties and drove it into the pores of every living thing foolish enough to stand upright. Luke McKenna pulled the brim of his hat lower, squinting against the relentless assault of dust. But the grit found its way into his eyes regardless. He felt as brittle as the yellow grass crunching beneath the hooves of his gelding. He rode down the main thoroughfare of Benton Creek, a cattle town that looked as though it had been nailed together in a hurry and left to rot in the sun. The buildings were gray and weathered, their false fronts peering down like empty skulls. The street was a churned mess of dried mud and horse manure, hardened into ruts that could twist an ankle if a man was not careful. Luke felt the familiar, heavy weight of failure sitting in his chest. He had just come from the stockyards, where he had sold 20 head of cattle. The steers had been gaunt, their ribs showing through dusty hides, victims of the drought that had turned his range into a tinderbox. The buyer had looked at the animals, spat a stream of brown tobacco juice near Luke's boot, and offered a price that was an insult. Luke had taken it because he had no choice. The bank in the city was sending letters, the polite phrasing of the clerks failing to mask the threat of foreclosure. He patted his coat pocket. The envelope containing the cash felt thin. It was enough to pay the interest on his loan and buy flour and coffee, but not enough to fix the windmill or buy the hay he would need if the winter turned hard. He was 35 years old, though the sun and the war had carved lines into his face that made him look 50. He felt out of place here, amidst the noise of piano music spilling from the saloons and the shouts of drovers blowing their pay on whiskey and cards. Luke guided his horse toward the livery stable, intending to water the beast before the long ride back to the empty silence of his ranch. He passed the Golden Garter, the largest and loudest establishment in town. The smell of stale beer and unwashed bodies drifted out the bat-wing doors. He kept his eyes forward, having lost his taste for such places years ago. A sudden crash from the alleyway between the saloon and the general store made him pull back on the reins. The back door of the Golden Garter flew open, banging against the clapboard wall. A woman stumbled out, her boots skidding in the dirt. She nearly fell, catching herself on a rain barrel. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was a tangled mess, half pinned and half falling down her back. Her dress, a gaudy thing of red silk meant to catch the eye under dim lantern light, was torn at the shoulder, revealing pale skin marred by a fresh, angry scrape. She clutched a carpetbag to her chest with a white-knuckled desperation. It was small, made of worn tapestry, and she held it as if it contained the crown jewels of England. "Get back here! Eve!" a voice boomed from the doorway. Luke watched, freezing in the saddle. A man stepped out into the harsh afternoon light. It was Cade, the owner of the Golden Garter. He was a big man, thick through the chest and belly, wearing a striped vest that strained against his bulk. His face was flushed with heat and rage. Flanking him were 2 men Luke recognized as hired muscle, the kind who drifted from town to town breaking thumbs for coin. The woman, Eve, scrambled backward, her eyes wide and frantic. She did not scream. She looked too terrified to find the breath for it. "Please," she gasped. Her voice was a dry rattle. "Just let me go. I have nothing left." Cade laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "You have got plenty left, darling. You owe me, and you are not walking out on a debt." He lunged forward with surprising speed for a heavy man. He grabbed her upper arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. Eve cried out, a sharp, jagged sound that cut through the noise of the street. Luke saw the bruises already blooming on her wrist, old yellow ones mixing with fresh purple marks. Cade raised his free hand and slapped her. It was not a casual strike. It was a brutal, open-handed blow that snapped her head to the side. Eve crumbled, dropping to her knees in the dust. But she did not let go of the carpetbag. The street had gone quiet. Men on the boardwalk stopped their conversations. A woman carrying a basket of eggs turned her children away, hurrying them down the street. They watched, some with mild amusement, others with the wary stillness of prey animals hoping the predator would not turn their way. No one moved to help. In Benton Creek, Cade was the law. Or at least he paid the law enough to look the other way. Luke felt a coldness settle in his gut. It was a sensation he remembered from the war, the moment before a skirmish when the thinking stopped and the doing began. He did not want this trouble. He could not afford this trouble. But the sound of that slap, the sickening meat-on-meat impact, echoed in his ears. He swung his leg over the saddle and dropped to the ground. His boots hit the earth with a heavy thud. He tied his reins to the hitching post with deliberate slowness, then walked toward the alley. "That is enough." "Cade," Luke said. His voice was not loud, but it was the voice he used to calm spooked horses, low and steady. Cade turned, his lip curled in a sneer. He did not release Eve's arm. "Well now, if it is not the dirt farmer McKenna. You looking to buy some company, Luke? Because she is not for sale right now. She is being disciplined." "Let her go," Luke said. He stopped 6 feet away, his hands hanging loose by his sides. He was not wearing a gun belt. He had left his Colt in his saddlebag, a habit born of trying to look peaceful in town. He regretted it now. "This is none of your business." "Plowboy," one of the thugs grunted, stepping forward. He rested his hand on the butt of a revolver tucked into his waistband. Luke ignored the hired gun. He looked at the woman. She was trembling so violently that her teeth chattered, though the afternoon was sweltering. Blood trickled from the corner of her mouth. She looked up at him, and Luke felt the breath leave his lungs. Her eyes were green, or they had been once. Now they were glassy and shattered, filled with a horror that went deeper than the man standing over her. "Please," she whispered. Her voice was so faint Luke had to strain to hear it. "I have to leave. I will die here." "She is property." Cade spat. He gave her arm a vicious shake. "She owes me $300 in room and board and medicines. She works it off, or she stays in the cribs until she rots." "She is not property," Luke said. He felt the anger rising, hot and tight in his throat. "No one is property. Not anymore." Cade scoffed. "Look at her. McKenna. She is a junkie, a laudanum-soaked whore who would sell her own mother for a bottle of yellow drops. You think you are being a knight in shining armor? She will pick your pocket and cut your throat before the sun goes down." Eve flinched at the words, shame flooding her face with color. She looked down at the dirt, her grip on the carpetbag tightening. "I do not care what she is," Luke said. "I am telling you to take your hands off her." "You going to make me?" Cade challenged. Luke stepped forward. He was leaner than Cade, hardened by years of fixing fences and wrestling calves, while Cade was soft with saloon living. "I will pay her debt," Luke said. The words left his mouth before he could stop them. Cade paused, his eyes narrowing. He looked at Luke, then down at the woman, calculating. $300. "I do not have 300, Luke said. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the envelope. He did not count it. He knew exactly what was in there. "I have $180. That is every dime I have." The crowd watched, silent and expectant. $180 was a fortune to a man like Luke. It was his seed money, his winter survival, his dignity. Cade looked at the money, then at Eve. He seemed to weigh the hassle of keeping her against the cash in Luke's hand. She was broken, likely near the end of her usefulness to him anyway. $180, Cade repeated. He let go of Eve's arm. She slumped sideways, catching herself with one hand in the dust. "You are a fool, McKenna. She is not worth $10, let alone the price of a good herd." Luke stepped past the thugs and extended the envelope. Cade snatched it, checking the contents quickly before shoving it into his vest. "She is yours," Cade said, wiping his hand on his trousers as if he had touched something filthy. "But do not think you can bring her back when she starts screaming for her fix. No refunds." Luke did not look at Cade. He knelt beside Eve. She flinched away from him, curling into a ball. "It is all right," Luke said softly. "I am not going to hurt you. Can you stand?" Eve looked up at him. Her face was streaked with dust and tears. The pupil of her eye was a pinprick, then dilated, shifting with a chaotic rhythm that spoke of a body at war with itself. She reached out and gripped his sleeve, Her fingers were ice cold. Despite the heat, "Save me," she whispered. Luke nodded. "I'm getting you out of here." "No," she hissed, pulling him closer. The smell of stale perfume and sickness wafted from her. "Not just from here. Save me 3 times a day." Luke frowned, confused. "What?" "Morning, noon, night." She recited the words like a litany, her voice cracking. "You have to promise. If you do not, I will crawl back to them. I will crawl back to the bottle. You have to save me when the demon comes." Luke looked into her eyes and saw the sheer, naked terror there. She was not asking to be rescued from Cade. She was asking to be rescued from herself. It was a prayer, humiliating and raw. He felt a pang of recognition in his gut. He knew what it was to be haunted. He knew what it was to need something so badly it made you forget who you were. "I promise," Luke said. The words felt heavy, a vow he did not fully understand but could not refuse. He stood up and offered her his hand. She took it, her grip weak. He pulled her to her feet. She swayed, dizzy, and he had to catch her by the waist to keep her upright. She felt frail, nothing but bird bones and trembling skin under the torn silk. "Get your horse," Luke told her. "I have no horse," she said, staring at the ground. Luke nodded grimly. "Then you ride with me." He guided her toward his gelding. The crowd parted for them, their eyes following the pair. Luke could feel their judgment. He was the fool rancher who had just spent his life savings on a woman the whole town knew as a lost cause. He saw the sheriff leaning against a post across the street, picking his teeth with a splinter of wood. The lawmen watched them go, making no move to intervene, a smirk playing on his lips. Luke lifted Eve onto the back of his horse. She settled awkwardly behind the saddle, wrapping her arms around his waist. He could feel her shivering against his back, a constant, fine vibration. He mounted up, the leather creaking. He did not look back at Cade or the Golden Garter. He turned the horse's head toward the open prairie and kicked it into a walk. They rode in silence for the first hour. The town of Broken Ridge faded behind them, becoming a smudge of gray smoke against the vast, blue horizon. The land opened up, endless and indifferent. The plains were a sea of brown and gold, broken only by the occasional twist of a mesquite bush or the skeletal white shape of a dead cottonwood. The heat was oppressive. The sun hammered down on their shoulders, and the wind blew hot and dry, sucking the moisture from their skin. Dust devils danced in the distance, swirling columns of grit that rose 100 feet into the air before collapsing. Eve did not speak. She clung to Luke's coat, her face pressed against his spine. He could feel the tension in her body increasing with every mile. The shivering that had been a subtle vibration in town was becoming a violent tremor. Luke tried to focus on the trail, but his mind was racing. He had no money. He had a stranger on the back of his horse who was likely addicted to laudanum, a drug that took hold of a soul and never let go. He had no plan. He had acted on instinct, on a foolish impulse to stop a cruelty, and now he had to live with the consequences. 2 hours out of town, Eve's grip on him tightened spasmodically. "Stop!" she gasped. "Please, stop!" Luke reined in the horse. "Whoa, easy!" He twisted in the saddle. Eve's face was pale, glistening with a cold sweat. Her eyes were wild. I need to get down," she stammered. Luke dismounted and reached up to help her. She practically fell into his arms, her legs unable to support her. He lowered her to the ground in the shade of the horse. She curled up in the dry grass, clutching her stomach. "Is it the sickness?" Luke asked, feeling helpless. He had seen men with the shakes after a long drunk, but this looked worse. She nodded, her teeth gritted. "It is time. It is noon, or past noon. My body knows. It wants it." She began to rock back and forth, a low moan escaping her lips. Her hands clawed at the carpet bag she still held. Luke saw her struggle, saw her fingers twitch toward the latch, then pull back. "Save me," she choked out. "You promised." Luke knelt beside her. He did not know what to do. He was a man who fixed fences and branded cattle. He dealt with problems he could hit or tie down. This was a battle happening inside her blood. "What do I do?" he asked. Just sit, she said, her voice thin. Do not let me run. Do not let me take it. Talk to me. Make it real. Luke sat down in the dirt. He felt ridiculous and terrified. He took off his hat and turned it in his hands. All right, he said. I am sitting. Hold my hand, she whispered. He hesitated, then reached out. Her hand was small and damp. She gripped his rough, calloused fingers with a strength that surprised him. Her nails dug into his skin. Talk, she commanded, squeezing her eyes shut. Luke cleared his throat. It felt dry. I do not know what to say. Anything, she cried out, her body arching in a spasm of pain. Just tell me something that is not this. Luke looked out at the horizon. He focused on the only thing he knew. The grass is dry, he said, his voice low. We have not had rain in 3 months. The creek on the north section is just mud now. I have been having to drive the herd to the river, which is 5 miles out of the way. It walks the tallow right off them. Eve whimpered, but she nodded. Keep going. There is a hawk, Luke said, watching a speck circle in the blue sky. A red-tail. He is hunting, probably looking for a jackrabbit. The rabbits are hiding, though. It is too hot. Even the coyotes are quiet today. He continued to speak, his voice a steady drone against the wind. He talked about the broken fence line in the east pasture. He talked about the way the light hit the canyon walls at sunset. He talked about the price of barbed wire. He did not know how long they sat there. It might have been 20 minutes. It might have been an hour. Eve rode waves of agony, sweating and shaking, sometimes gripping his hand until his fingers went numb, sometimes weeping softly. Luke did not pull away. He sat like a stone, an anchor for her to hold on to while the storm raged inside her. Eventually, the tremors subsided. Eve's breathing slowed. She opened her eyes. They were red-rimmed and exhausted, but the wild panic was gone. It passed. She whispered, her voice hoarse. Luke nodded. He gently extricated his hand. His fingers were white where she had squeezed them. You ready to ride? She nodded weakly. I think so. He helped her up. She was lighter than before, if that was possible. He lifted her onto the horse, then mounted up. As they continued the journey, she did not cling to him quite as desperately. She leaned her forehead against his back, and he could feel the steady rhythm of her breathing. They reached the ranch well after dark. The moon had risen, painting the plains in shades of silver and charcoal. The ranch house was a small, low structure made of rough-hewn logs and sod. It sat alone in the vastness, a tiny island of human effort in an ocean of grass. To the west, the outline of the barn and the corral stood black against the sky. A windmill creaked rhythmically, a lonely sound that Luke had listened to every night for 10 years. Luke helped Eve down. She was so stiff she could barely walk. He guided her into the house. The air inside was stale and hot. He struck a match and lit the kerosene lamp on the table. The golden light revealed a simple room, a table with 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, a wash basin, and a narrow door leading to the only bedroom. Sit, Luke said, pulling out a chair. Eve collapsed into it. She looked around, her eyes dull. It is quiet, she murmured. Too quiet. Sometimes, Luke admitted. I will make some coffee, and there is some salt pork and biscuits left from breakfast. You need to eat. I'm not hungry, she said. You eat anyway, Luke said gently but firmly. You are fading away. He bustled about the small kitchen, grateful for the familiar tasks. He started a fire in the stove, filled the kettle, and sliced the pork. Eve watched him, her gaze following his movements as if he were a puzzle she could not solve. Why? She asked suddenly. Luke paused, the knife in his hand. Why what? Why did you do it? You gave him everything you had. For me, you do not even know me. Luke looked at the dark window, seeing his own reflection in the glass. He thought of the war. He thought of the men he had killed, and the men he had failed to save. He thought of the bottle of whiskey that had been his only friend for 5 years after the surrender, until he had woken up in a ditch one morning and decided he wanted to live. I do not like bullies, Luke said simply. and I do not like seeing things caged. He served her the food. She ate mechanically, swallowing small bites with difficulty. After she had finished half a biscuit, she pushed the plate away. "I am so tired," she whispered. Luke nodded. "You take the bed, but where will you sleep? I have a bedroll. I will sleep out here by the stove. It is warm." He showed her to the bedroom. It was sparse, a wooden frame bed with a quilt his mother had made, a washstand, and a chest of drawers. He lit a candle for her and set it on the stand. "Sleep," he said. "You are safe here. Cade is a long ride away." Eve looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of deception. "Thank you, Luke," she said softly. He closed the door and retreated to the main room. He spread his bedroll on the floor, blew out the lamp, and lay down in the dark. His body was exhausted, aching from the ride and the tension, but his mind would not settle. He lay there, listening to the wind rattle the shutters and the distant yipping of coyotes on the ridge. He had no money. He had a drug addict in his bedroom. He had likely made an enemy of the most dangerous man in the county. "You are a fool. Luke McKenna," he whispered to the darkness. He finally drifted into a fitful sleep, haunted by images of dry riverbeds and dying cattle. He was awakened by a scream. It was a high, piercing sound of pure terror. Luke was on his feet before he was fully awake, his heart hammering against his ribs. He rushed to the bedroom door and threw it open. Eve was thrashing in the bed, tangled in the quilt. She was screaming, fighting an invisible attacker. "No, no, please, get off me!" Luke crossed the room in 2 strides. He grabbed her shoulders, trying to pin her to the mattress so she would not hurt herself. "Eve, wake up! It is Luke! You are safe!" She fought him, her eyes wide open but seeing nothing. She clawed at his arms, her nails raking his skin. "He is here! He is hurting me!" Luke sat on the edge of the bed and pulled her into his arms, wrapping her up tight so her flailing hands were trapped against his chest. He rocked her, speaking into her hair. "Shh! I have got you. You are at the ranch. Cade is not here. I am here." "It is just a dream," she sobbed, a deep, wrenching sound that shook her entire frame. She buried her face in the hollow of his neck, her tears hot against his skin. "I can feel them," she gasped. "I can feel their hands. There are no hands here but mine," Luke said, his voice rumbling in his chest. "And my hands are just holding you up." He held her while she cried, feeling the sharp angles of her shoulder blades and the frantic racing of her heart. The smell of her fear was sharp in the small room. Slowly, the tension left her body. She went limp against him, exhausted. Luke did not let go. He kept rocking her, staring over her head at the moonlight spilling across the floorboards. This was the 3rd time. Morning, noon, and night. She had warned him. She had told him exactly what this would be. And as he sat there in the dark, listening to the coyotes call to one another across the lonely miles, Luke realized the truth of it. He had not just paid a debt. He had not just offered a ride. He had taken on a war. He tightened his arms around her slightly. "I am here," he whispered again into the silence. And for the first time in a long time, Luke McKenna felt like he had a reason to be. Time on the high plains did not move in hours or minutes. It moved in the slow, grinding rhythm of sun and shadow, of wind and silence. For Luke McKenna and Eve Harrington, time was measured in the terrifying intervals between cravings. A routine, fragile as a new calf but just as necessary, began to take shape in the small sod house. It always began before the sun had fully crested the eastern ridges. The world was a bruised purple, the air biting with a chill that seemed to seep up from the ground itself. Luke would wake first, pulling on his boots in the dark, the leather stiff with cold. He would step out to the corral to break the thin skiff of ice on the water troughs, his breath puffing in white clouds that were snatched away instantly by the morning breeze. The cattle were restless, sensing the emptiness of the range, their lowing sounds mournful in the gray light. When he returned to the house, stomping the mud from his boots on the porch, he would find her at the kitchen table. Eve was always there, wrapped in a coarse wool blanket he had given her. Her hands clutched around a tin cup of black coffee as if it were the only anchor keeping her from drifting off the face of the earth. She looked like a ghost in the dawn light. Her skin was the color of old parchment, damp with a sickly sheen of sweat, and her eyes were wide, staring at things that were not there. The morning fog of withdrawal was upon her, a physical weight that made her shoulders hunch and her teeth chatter. Luke would pour himself a cup and sit opposite her. He did not touch her. He simply sat, his large presence filling the empty space across the table. "The wind is shifting out of the north," he would say, his voice low and gravelly, cutting through the silence. "Looks like we might get some weather later in the week." Eve would nod, a jerky, mechanical motion. "Weather." She would whisper, testing the word. "That roan mare has a stone in her shoe." Luke would continue, sipping his coffee. "I need to tend to it before I ride out to the south pasture. The grass down there is burnt out, but there might be some strays hiding in the scrub oak." He spoke about cattle. He spoke about the price of barbed wire. He spoke about the way the light hit the canyon walls. It was dull, repetitive talk. And it was exactly what she needed. It was the first saving of the day. His voice was a rope, thrown into the dark pit of her mind, pulling her back to the reality of wood and iron and coffee. For 10 minutes, she was not a junkie fighting the itch in her veins. She was just a woman listening to a man talk about his day. When he stood to leave, the spell would break slightly, panic flaring in her eyes. But he would nod to her. "I will be back at noon." He would promise, and he always was. At midday, the sun was no longer a promise, but a hammer. It beat down on the cracked earth until the heat line shimmered like water that wasn't there. The wind turned hot, scraping the skin raw with fine grit. Luke would ride in from the fields, his shirt stuck to his back, dust coating his eyebrows and mustache. Eve would be waiting on the porch. By noon, the morning fog had burned off, replaced by a sharp, jagged clarity that was almost worse. Her nerves were like exposed wires. Every creak of the windmill, every buzz of a fly, seemed to echo in her skull like a gunshot. He would wash his face at the basin by the door, sputtering water, then sit beside her on the bench. They sat shoulder to shoulder, not touching, looking out at the endless horizon. "Breathe," Luke would say. She would try. Her breath would hitch, shallow and frantic. "With me," he commanded softly. "In, out." They counted breaths together. 1, 2, 3. They watched the shadow of the porch post creep across the dust. They watched the hawk circling high above in the blinding blue. They sat until the frantic urgency in Eve's blood, the screaming need to run, to find a bottle, to beg for oblivion, began to recede just enough to be bearable. This was the second saving. The days between these moments were a battlefield. Luke had laid down rules the first night, his voice leaving no room for argument. "No visitors, unless I say so." He had told her, "If a rider comes up the track, you go to the bedroom and stay quiet." Eve had nodded. She had no desire to be seen. No laudanum. Luke had said next, his eyes hard, "Not a drop. If you have any hidden in that bag, you burn it, or you leave. I will not have it in my house. I have none." She had lied, though the small vial hidden in the lining of her carpetbag burned a hole in her conscience. "And you work," Luke had finished. "You are not a guest, and you are not a prisoner. If you eat here, you work here. It will keep your hands busy." So she tried. God, how she tried. But her body was in revolt. The withdrawal was not a linear path. It was a series of ambushes. She would be sweeping the floor, the broom feeling heavy as a lead pipe, when a wave of nausea would buckle her knees. She spent hours retching into a bucket, her stomach cramping until she thought her ribs would snap. She sweated through her dress, then shivered until her teeth ached. One afternoon, she tried to wash the few dishes they owned. Her hands were trembling so badly the water in the basin slopped over the sides. She picked up a plate, one of the few ceramic ones Luke's mother had left him, and her fingers simply refused to hold it. It slipped. The sound of it shattering on the floor was deafening in the small house. Eve froze. The noise triggered a memory of Cade, of broken glass, of a backhand slap that would inevitably follow a mistake. She dropped to her knees, scrambling to pick up the shards, slicing her thumb on a jagged edge. Blood welled up, bright red against the gray dust. "I am sorry," she gasped, her voice cracking into a sob. I am sorry, please, I will pay for it. I will fix it." She was babbling, terrifyingly certain that violence was coming. A shadow fell over her. She flinched, curling into a ball. Luke knelt beside her. He did not shout. He did not raise his hand. He reached out and gently took her wrist, stopping her frantic movements. "Stop, Eve," he said. "I am clumsy. I am useless," she cried, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her face. "It is a plate," Luke said. "It is just a plate." He took the shard from her other hand and set it aside. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and wrapped it around her bleeding thumb. His movements were slow and deliberate. "Go sit down," he said. "I will sweep this up." She watched him from the table, her chest heaving. He swept the pieces into the dustpan and tossed them into the stove. He did not sigh with annoyance. He did not glare. He simply cleaned the mess and went back to mending a bridle. The absence of anger was more shocking to her than any blow would have been. In the quiet moments that followed, when the nausea passed and her hand steadied, she began to watch him. She watched him in the evenings when he came in to wash up for supper. He would roll his shirt sleeves up past his elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle and darkened by the sun. There were scars there, white, jagged lines from barbed wire, and a puckered round mark on his left tricep that looked like an old bullet wound. He scrubbed his face and neck, water dripping from his chin, shaking his head like a wet dog. There was a solidity to him that she had never known in a man. The men she had known in the saloon were soft with vice or hard with cruelty. Luke was hard like the land was hard, enduring, weathered, but capable of growth. She felt an ache in her chest that had nothing to do with the laudanum. It was a wary, hungry desire, a longing to touch that strength and see if it could hold her up without crushing her. She began to talk. It started in fits and starts during the evening meals, or in the quiet dark of the third saving. At night, the prairie turned into a black sea. The wind howled around the corners of the house, making the timbers groan. The isolation felt absolute. This was when the demons were loudest, whispering to Eve that she was alone, that she was worthless, that the darkness outside was coming in to swallow her. Luke would knock on her bedroom door. He would bring a chair in and sit by the foot of the bed while she lay under the quilt, clutching the fabric to her chin. "I was not always like this," she said one night. Her voice was small in the darkness. Luke leaned back in the chair, his face in shadow. "Tell me, my father was a doctor." She said, "In St. Louis. We had a house with a piano. I can play, or I read books. I was going to marry a lawyer named Thomas." She paused, waiting for the disbelief, but Luke just waited. "Father was a good man, but he was a bad gambler." She continued, "He thought he could beat the house. He couldn't. When he died, he left nothing but paper debts. Cade bought the paper. He came to the house the day after the funeral. He said I could work it off. He said it would be clerical work in his establishment out west." She laughed, a bitter, brittle sound. "I was so stupid. I believed him. By the time we got to Benton Creek, I knew, but I was 3 states away from anyone who knew my name." "And the laudanum?" Luke asked gently. Eve turned her head to look at the wall. It started with a toothache. "Cade gave me some. And then I realized that when I took it, the nights didn't hurt as much. The men didn't have faces. I could float above the bed. I could be back in St. Louis playing the piano." She swallowed hard, shame tightening her throat. "I started begging for it. Luke, I let them do whatever they wanted, as long as I could have the bottle afterwards. It was easier than feeling. It was easier than being me." The silence stretched out, heavy and thick. Eve waited for the judgment. She waited for him to stand up and leave, disgusted by the weakness of a woman who would trade her body for yellow drops. Instead, Luke shifted in his chair. The wood creaked. "I was in the war," he said. His voice was distant. "Down on the border. We were chasing raiders. I was 18. He rubbed his face with his hand. "We rode into a village one morning. We thought it was a stronghold. It wasn't. It was just families. By the time the shooting stopped, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. I came back here." Luke said, "The land was quiet, but my head wasn't. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them. So I drank. I drank whiskey until I couldn't stand up. I drank until I fell off my horse. I drank until the bank threatened to take the ranch the first time." He looked at her, his eyes catching a glint of moonlight. "I know what it is to want to turn the world off. Eve, I know what it is to be willing to die just to stop the noise for an hour." Eve looked at him, tears pricking her eyes. "You stopped. I stopped." Luke agreed. "But I still want it. Sometimes, when the drought is bad, or the wind won't quit. I can taste the whiskey on my tongue. It never really goes away. You just get stronger than it is." He stood up then. "The third saving complete. Sleep now. Eve, you are not that girl in the saloon anymore. And I am not that boy in the village." He left the room, closing the door softly. Eve lay in the dark, her heart aching with a gratitude so sharp it felt like a wound. He had offered her his own shame to balance hers. 2 weeks into her stay, the weather broke. It did not rain gently. The sky turned a bruised, greenish-black in the late afternoon. The temperature plunged 20 degrees in an hour. Luke came in from the barn early, his face grim. "Whatever is loose, tie it down," he said. "This is going to be a bad one." By nightfall, the storm was upon them. Thunder shook the ground, a physical vibration that rattled the plates in the cupboard. Lightning flashed so constantly that the room strobed like a flickering lantern. The wind hit the house with the force of a freight train, shrieking through the chinks in the logs. Rain began to fall, torrential and icy. The roof, dried out by months of drought, began to leak. Water dripped onto the table, onto the floor, hissing against the hot stove. Eve was in the bedroom, pacing. The noise was unbearable. It sounded like the saloon on a Saturday night. The shouting, the crashing, the violence. The thunder sounded like gunshots. Every flash of lightning threw long, grasping shadows against the walls. She felt the panic rising, a tidal wave of terror. She was trapped. Cade was coming. The storm was Cade. He was going to tear the roof off and drag her back. She ran into the main room. Luke was by the window, stuffing rags into a gap where the rain was driving in. "Luke!" she screamed, the thunder swallowing her voice. He turned. A flash of lightning illuminated her face, white and twisted with fear. "Eve, don't leave me!" She ran to him, clutching his wet shirt front. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably. "Don't let them in, please! Luke, don't let them in!" He grabbed her arms. "Eve, it is just a storm. Nobody is here. It's too loud. I can't be alone." "I can't be in there." She was hyperventilating, her knees buckling. The roof in the bedroom had given way in one corner, water pouring onto her bed. The whole house felt like it was dissolving under the assault. Luke looked around. The kitchen was wet and cold. The only dry place left was the narrow bed he had been using near the stove. But even that was getting damp from the spray. "All right," he said, his voice shouting over the wind. "Come here." He led her to the narrow cot pushed against the interior wall, the driest spot in the house. "Sit down," he ordered. She sat, her teeth chattering so hard she couldn't speak. She grabbed his hand and pulled. "Stay, please. I will die if I am alone." Luke hesitated. He looked at the woman trembling before him, then at the storm raging outside. He was exhausted, and she was on the verge of shattering. "Move over," he said gruffly. He lay down on the edge of the mattress, his back to the room. Eve curled up against the wall. There was barely enough room for 2 people. Their bodies were pressed together by necessity. separated only by the rough wool of the blanket he had pulled over them. The warmth of him was shocking. Eve had been cold for what felt like years, the heat radiating from his back, the solid weight of him on the mattress, anchored her in the chaos. The thunder boomed directly overhead, and she gasped, pressing her forehead against his shoulder blade. He stiffened, but he did not pull away. "Luke," she whispered. "I am here," he said. She shifted, turning to face his back. The desire that had been simmering for days flared up, hot and sudden. It was not the drug-hazed compliance she was used to. It was a clean, sharp want. She wanted his arms around her. She wanted to feel skin against skin, to prove that she was alive, that she was more than just a broken thing to be fixed. She moved her hand, resting it tentatively on his arm. He flinched, as if burned. Luke turned his head. His face was inches from hers in the dark. She could feel his breath on her cheek, warm and smelling of coffee. "Don't," he whispered. His voice was strained. Eve looked at his mouth. She wanted to kiss him. She wanted to be held. "Just hold me," she breathed. "Please." She saw the conflict in his eyes. He wanted her. She could feel the tension in his body, the way his breath hitched. It would be so easy. She was willing. She was begging. But Luke McKenna pulled back. He moved his head an inch away, reestablishing the line between them. He reached down and took her hand, placing it firmly back on her own side of the blanket. "No," he said. "Why?" she asked, hurt, stinging her eyes. "Am I too dirty?" "No," he said fiercely. "Never that." "Then why?" "Because you are scared," he said. "And you are sick. And you are trapped in a storm with the man who bought you." "I'm not." She started. "You are." He cut her off. "If I touch you now, if I take what you are offering, I am just another Cade. I am just another man taking advantage of a woman who thinks she has to pay for her safety." He looked her dead in the eye, his gaze intense. "I will not be that man. Eve, I won't touch you until you are truly free, until you don't need saving anymore, until you can choose me because you want me, not because you need a roof over your head." Eve stared at him. The rejection stung, but beneath the sting was something else, a profound, terrifying respect. He was giving her agency when she didn't even know she had lost it. He was protecting her from himself. She let out a long, shaky breath. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay. Turn around," he said gently. "Go to sleep." She turned her back to him. He lay behind her, close enough that she could feel his warmth, far enough that there was no mistake. The storm raged on, battering the little house. But the terror in Eve's chest began to unclench. She fell asleep to the sound of his breathing, steady and deep, a rhythm she could follow into the dark. The morning broke with a silence that rang in the ears. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and cold. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue. The mud outside was thick and heavy, but the air smelled of sage and wet earth. Luke was already up when Eve woke. She sat up in the narrow bed, her hair tangled, the memory of the night before flooding back, her face heated. She had begged him. She had offered herself, and he had said no. She walked into the kitchen area. Luke was at the stove, frying salt pork. He looked tired, dark circles under his eyes, but his back was straight. He turned as she entered. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them crackled. It was awkward, heavy with the things that had been said and the things that hadn't. But beneath the awkwardness was a current of electricity. "Morning." Luke said, "Morning." Eve replied. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Roof needs fixing," Luke said, turning back to the pan. "And the corral fence is down in 2 places. I can help with the roof," Eve said. I can hold the ladder. Or hand you tools." Luke looked at her over his shoulder. A corner of his mouth twitched upward, a ghost of a smile. "I reckon you can," he said. He plated the food and set it on the table. As she reached for the coffee pot, their fingers brushed. It was a momentary contact, gone in a heartbeat, but Eve felt it all the way to her toes. She pulled her hand back, her heart hammering. She looked at him, and he looked at her, in the harsh morning light, stripped of shadows and secrets. She saw the hunger in his eyes. It mirrored her own. But she also saw the promise he had made. He would wait, and for the first time in her life, Eve realized that she was worth waiting for. "Eat up," Luke said, his voice rough. "We have got work to do." "Yes," Eve said, sitting down. "Yes, we do." She took a sip of the bitter coffee, and for the first time since she had arrived, she did not dread the day ahead. She was still shaking. Her body still craved the poison. But she looked at the man across the table and felt a new, fierce hope taking root in the ruin of her heart. She would get clean. She would get strong. And when she was free, she knew exactly what she would do with her freedom. 3 weeks had burned away since the storm, leaving the high plains scoured and thirsty. The earth had swallowed the rain as if it had never fallen, and the drought returned with a vengeance that cracked the ground into a jigsaw of dry fissures. It was necessity, not desire, that forced Luke McKenna to hitch the team to the wagon and head for Benton Creek. The flour barrel was scraping bottom. The coffee tin was empty, and they needed fencing staples to repair the damage the wind had wrought on the south pasture. Eve sat beside him on the wagon bench. She wore a dress Luke had found in an old trunk of his mother's, a simple calico print of faded blue flowers that had been fashionable 20 years ago. It was too big in the waist and too short in the sleeves, but she had washed and mended it with a fierce determination. She wore a bonnet pulled low, shadowing her face, but her hands, folded in her lap, were white-knuckled. "You do not have to come in," Luke said, his eyes scanning the shimmering horizon. "I can leave you at the livery, or you can wait in the wagon." "No," Eve said. Her voice was thin but steady. "If I hide, they win. I cannot stay in the dark forever." "Luke." Luke nodded, respecting the grit in her tone, even as he felt a knot of worry tighten in his gut. She had been doing better. The vomiting had stopped, mostly. The shaking was confined to the mornings and the deep nights. But she was fragile. She was a porcelain cup that had been glued back together. One hard knock might shatter her for good. They rolled into Benton Creek just past noon. The town was sweltering, the air thick with the smell of horse manure and dust. As the wagon creaked down the main street, heads turned. Conversation on the boardwalk sputtered and died. Luke felt the weight of the stairs. They were not curious stares. They were heavy, judgmental, and sharp. He saw Mrs. Gable, the deacon's wife, pause outside the millinery shop. She watched them pass, her lips pursed so tight they disappeared, her eyes tracking Eve like a hawk watching a field mouse. "Ignore them," Luke muttered, flicking the reins. They pulled up in front of the General Mercantile. Luke set the brake and walked around to help Eve down. As he took her hand, he felt the tremor running through her. "I am all right," she whispered, though her skin was clammy. They entered the store. A bell jingled above the door, a cheerful sound that died instantly in the heavy silence of the room. The air inside was cool and smelled of pickle brine, leather, and dry goods. 3 women were at the counter, inspecting a bolt of gingham. They turned. The conversation stopped as if cut with a knife. Mrs. Gable, who had evidently hurried inside through the side door, stood with her 2 young daughters near the candy jars. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, with a rustle of stiff petticoats, Mrs. Gable stepped between Eve and her children. "Come along, Sarah, Mary," she said, her voice loud and brittle in the quiet store. "We will come back when the air is cleaner." She herded the girls toward the door, sweeping past Eve with her chin high, pulling her skirts aside as if avoiding a puddle of filth. The other women followed, casting glances that were a mixture of disgust and morbid fascination. Eve stood frozen. Her face burned a dull, painful red. She lowered her head, staring at the scarred floorboards. Luke felt a heat rise in his chest that had nothing to do with the sun. He stepped up to the counter. The storekeeper, Mr. Abernathy, a man Luke had traded with for 10 years, was suddenly very interested in wiping a spot on the countertop. "I need a sack of flour." "Silas," Luke said, his voice hard. 5 pounds of coffee, 10 pounds of beans, and a box of fencing staples. Abernathy did not look up. He fetched the items in silence, slapping the sacks onto the counter with unnecessary force. The dust motes danced in the shafts of light coming through the dirty windows. "That will be $4.50, Abernathy mumbled. Luke reached into his pocket. He counted out the coins, hard-earned silver that represented sweat and blood, and placed them on the counter. Eve, feeling the need to prove she existed, to prove she was a human being and not just a stain on the town's conscience, reached into her small reticule. She had found a single silver dollar in the lining of her bag days ago and had insisted on paying for the coffee herself. "I have the dollar for the coffee," she said softly. She held the coin out to Abernathy. The storekeeper looked at her hand. It was clean, it was steady, but he did not take the coin. He looked at it with a sneer, as if it were contaminated. "Just put it down," he said. "I am handing it to you," Eve said, her voice trembling. "I said, put it down. I do not want to touch anything." Luke slammed his hand onto the counter. The sound was like a gunshot. The jar of peppermint sticks rattled. "Take the money." "Silas," Luke growled. "Take it from her hand like a gentleman." Abernathy flinched, looking up at Luke. He saw the fury in the rancher's eyes, a cold, blue fire that promised violence. But the storekeeper was a small man empowered by the town's collective morality. "I run a decent establishment." "Luke," Abernathy said, his voice rising defensively, "I have got respectable customers. I cannot be seen catering to Cade's leavings." Eve made a choked sound. She dropped the coin on the counter. It spun on its edge and rattled to a stop. "Let's go," she whispered. "Please, Luke, let's go." She turned and fled the store, her boots thudding on the floorboards. Luke stared at Abernathy for one long, dangerous second. "Keep the change," he spat. "And if you ever speak to her like that again, I will take my business to the next county, and I will take every rancher I know with me." He grabbed the supplies and stormed out. The sun outside was blinding. Eve was standing by the wagon, gripping the wood so hard her knuckles were white. Her breath was coming in short, shallow gasps. The craving was there. Luke could see it in the way she stood, the way her eyes darted toward the end of the street where the Golden Garter stood. The humiliation had stripped away her defenses. She wanted the numbness. She wanted to stop feeling the shame that misses. Gable and Abernathy had heaped upon her. "Eve," Luke said, dropping the sacks into the wagon bed. "Take me back," she said, her voice jagged. "Just take me back to the ranch. Or leave me here. I don't care. Well, look who it is." The voice was like oil poured over gravel. Luke turned slowly. Cade was leaning against the porch post of the saloon 3 doors down. He was smoking a cheroot, the smoke drifting lazily around his face. He wore a fine black coat, despite the heat, and a gold watch chain glittered on his vest. The sheriff, a man named Miller with a paunch and eyes that looked like wet stones, stepped out of the saloon to stand beside him. Miller's hand rested casually on the butt of his revolver. "You're looking a little pale." "Darling," Cade called out to Eve. "Country life not agreeing with you?" Eve flinched, shrinking against the side of the wagon. "Leave us be." "Cade," Luke said, stepping between the wagon and the saloon owner. "We have no business with you." "Oh, I think we have unfinished business." Cade smiled, pushing himself off the post and sauntering closer. "You bought her time, McKenna. You did not buy her soul. Look at her." He gestured with the cheroot. "She is shaking. She is dying for it. You think you can play house with a whore and turn her into a housewife?" Cade laughed, and the sheriff chuckled with him. "She is property." "McKenna," Cade said, his voice dropping to a menacing purr. "The law says a debt is a debt, and once she gets tired of playing farmer's wife, she will be back. No one else will have you. Eve, you know that. You are soil. You are used goods." Eve let out a sob, covering her mouth with her hand. "That is enough." Luke stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides. Sheriff Miller unhooked the leather thong over the hammer of his gun. "Easy now. Luke, you do not want to assault a businessman in broad daylight." I would hate to have to lock you up. Who would feed your cows then?" Luke froze. He looked from Cade to the sheriff. The threat was clear. The law in Benton Creek did not protect men like Luke McKenna. It protected the money, and the money was in whiskey and women. "If I see you near my land," Luke said, his voice low and vibrating with restraint, "I will shoot you, and I will not dig a hole to bury you." Cade smirked. "It is a free country, cowboy. Watch your back." Luke turned on his heel. He grabbed Eve by the waist and lifted her onto the wagon seat, then climbed up beside her. He snapped the reins, and the horses lurched forward. They rode out of town in a silence that was heavier than the supplies in the back. The wind whipped dust into their faces, stinging and relentless. For the first 5 miles, Eve stared at her hands. Then, as the town disappeared behind the rise of the land, she began to cry. It was a quiet, hopeless weeping. "You have to send me away," she said. Luke stared straight ahead, his jaw set like granite. "I am not sending you anywhere. You heard them," Eve said, her voice rising. "You saw them. I am poison. Luke, I am dragging you down. Abernathy, the sheriff." "They will ruin you because of me. You will lose the ranch. You will lose everything." "I do not care about Abernathy," Luke said. "You should," Eve cried. She turned to him, her face streaked with tears and dust. "Why are you doing this? I am not worth it. I am exactly what Cade said I am. I am a soiled dove. I am a junkie. Just let me go. I can go to Cheyenne. I can go anywhere." She was hysterical now, the shame of the store and the terror of Cade mixing into a poisonous cocktail. "Stop the wagon. Let me out." Luke pulled back on the reins. The horses blew hard, coming to a halt on a high ridge overlooking the valley. To the west, the sun was beginning to dip, painting the miles of gray-gold grass in amber light. Jagged rocks jutted from the earth like the bones of the world. Luke set the brake and turned to her. "Get down," he said. "What? Get down." He climbed down and walked to the edge of the ridge. Eve followed him slowly, confused and trembling. Luke stood looking out at the land he had fought for, the land that was currently trying to kill him with drought. He took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair. "You think I am a boy?" he asked. He did not turn to face her. "No," Eve said. "You think I am some green kid who does not know that fire burns?" Luke turned then. His face was rough, the lines around his eyes deep with exhaustion. "I know what they say. I know what Cade is, and I know what this town is." He took a step toward her. "I did not pick you up because I wanted to be a hero. Eve, I picked you up because I looked at you, and I saw someone who was fighting the same war I was. I am losing the war," Eve whispered. "You are not losing," Luke said fiercely. "You stood in that store. You handed him that coin. That took more courage than Cade has ever had in his life." He closed the distance between them. The wind whipped her skirt around his legs. "I am not a boy who cannot choose his own trouble," Luke said, his voice dropping to a rasp. "I picked this. I picked you, and I do not walk away from my choices." Eve looked up at him. He was close. So close she could smell the scent of pine soap and sweat on him. His eyes were blazing with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. "But I will destroy you," she breathed. "Let me worry about that," he said. They stood there on the edge of the world, the wind howling around them, the tension that had been building for weeks, the shared breaths on the porch, the nights in the chair beside her bed. The raw intimacy of survival snapped tight. Luke's gaze dropped to her lips. Eve felt her heart hammer against her ribs. She wanted him to kiss her. She wanted to be consumed by him, to let his strength wash away the filth of the town. She leaned in, her eyelids fluttering shut. Their breath mingled. She felt the heat of his body radiating toward her. Then, the image of Cade flashed in her mind. Property. Used goods. If she kissed him now, was she paying him? Was this the transaction? He had saved her from the store, from the sheriff. Was this the cost? Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the desire. She pulled back, gasping. "No," she whispered, stepping back. Luke froze. He looked at her, his eyes searching. "I can't," she said, hugging her arms around herself. "Not like this. I can't pay you like that." Luke's face softened. The fire died down, replaced by a sad, steady patience. "I know," he said. "Save me," she begged, the old plea rising up. "Save me by not asking." "I am not asking," Luke said quietly. He put his hat back on. "Let's go home. The cattle need water." The drive back to the ranch was silent, but it was a different silence. It was not heavy with shame anymore. It was vibrating with the memory of the almost kiss, a fragile electric understanding that they had stepped to the edge of a precipice and pulled back, not because they didn't want to jump, but because they wanted to be sure they could fly. But the world did not care about their fragile understandings. The drought deepened. The sky remained a relentless, mocking blue. The creek that fed the lower pastures dried up completely 3 days after the trip to town, leaving only cracked mud and dead fish stinking in the heat. The letter from the bank arrived a week later. Luke read it at the kitchen table, his face impassive. "What does it say?" Eve asked. She was peeling potatoes, her hand steadier now, though she still dropped the knife sometimes. "Interest is up," Luke said, "and they want a payment on the principal, $400, by the 1st of the month. Do you have it?" Luke folded the letter carefully. "No." He stood up. "I have to go haul water. The upper spring is still running. But it is 5 miles from the herd." Luke began to work with a desperation that frightened her. He was up before dawn, riding out to the distant spring. He spent his days filling barrels, hauling them back to the troughs, the wagon groaning under the weight. He mended fences in the relentless wind, his hands bleeding from the barbs. He slept 4 hours a night, if that. Eve watched him fade. She saw the way his hands shook when he lifted his coffee cup in the morning, the liquid rippling. She saw the gray pallor of his skin under the tan, the way he stumbled when he got out of the chair. He was burning himself up. He was sacrificing his body, muscle by muscle, to keep the ranch and her alive. Guilt gnawed at her, sharper than the withdrawal cramps. He had spent his savings on her debt. If he had that $180, he could pay the interest. He could buy hay. She tried to help. She took over the cooking, making stews out of dried beans and salt pork. She mended his shirts. She even tried to haul water from the well for the house, though the bucket was heavy enough to strain her back. One afternoon, a rider appeared on the track. Eve's heart jumped, fearing the sheriff, but it was a young man on a paint horse. It was Tom, the neighbor from the ranch to the east. He was young, barely 20, with a face full of freckles and an easy smile. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, tipping his hat as Eve stepped onto the porch. "Is Luke about?" "He's at the south pasture," Eve said, wiping her hands on her apron. "He should be back soon." Tom nodded. "I just came to see if he needed a hand with the branding. My PA said you folks might be short-handed." Eve felt a flash of gratitude. It was the first kindness anyone outside the ranch had shown her. "You can wait, if you like. I have fresh coffee." Tom hesitated, then smiled. "Do not mind if I do." He sat on the porch, and they talked. He was polite, respectful. He did not look at her like she was a curiosity or a stain. He asked about the garden she was trying to start. He told her a funny story about a calf that got its head stuck in a bucket. For an hour, Eve felt like a normal woman. Then, the sound of buggy wheels crunching on gravel shattered the peace. A black buggy pulled by a high-stepping mare swung into the yard. A woman sat on the bench, holding the reins with stiff, gloved hands. It was Mrs. Gable. She was not Tom's mother, but she was his aunt. And in Benton Creek, family business was everyone's business. "Tom!" she shouted, her voice shrill. Tom jumped up, spilling his coffee. "Aunt Martha, get in this buggy." "Thomas," she commanded. "But I am helping Luke." "You will do no such thing," she screeched. Her eyes locked onto Eve, who stood in the doorway. "I will not have my nephew breaking bread with that kind of woman. Mrs. Gable." Tom started, his face turning red. "Do not you speak to me," she yelled. "The whole town knows what she is. She is a harlot who has bewitched a good man and is dragging his name through the mud. Luke McKenna used to be decent. Now he is keeping a saloon girl in his house like a pet. Eve felt the blood drain from her face. She stepped back into the shadows of the house, but the window was open. Every word cut her like a knife. "Get in, Thomas, or I will tell your mother you are courting sin." Tom looked at Eve, his face crumbling with apology and shame. He muttered a sorry that didn't reach the door, then walked to the buggy. "Mrs." Gable whipped the horse around. As they drove away, her voice drifted back through the hot, still air. "Disgraceful. If he loses his ranch, it is God's judgment. You stay away from her. You hear me? She is a disease." Eve stood in the middle of the kitchen. The silence that followed was suffocating. She looked around the room. She saw Luke's mended shirt on the chair. She saw the empty coffee tin. She saw the letter from the bank on the table. She was the disease. Mrs. Gable was right. Not about the sin, but about the ruin. She was the reason Luke was broke. She was the reason the town hated him. She was the reason he was working himself into an early grave. She walked to the window and watched Luke riding in from the south pasture. He was slumped in the saddle, his shoulders bowed with exhaustion. He looked like an old man. A cold, terrible clarity settled over her. Luke would never ask her to leave. He was too stubborn, too honorable. He would fight Cade, the bank, and the drought until his heart stopped beating, just to keep his promise. So she had to be the one to do it. To save him, she had to disappear. The thought made her knees weak. The idea of leaving the ranch, of facing the world alone again, terrified her. The shadows of the saloon, the taste of laudanum, the cold eyes of men like Cade. They were waiting for her out there, but looking at Luke, watching him dismount and stumble slightly as his boots hit the ground. Eve knew she had no choice. She would wait until he was asleep. She would take nothing but her carpet bag. She would walk to the road and hitch a ride on a freight wagon. Any wagon going west or east. She pressed her hand against the rough glass of the window pane. 3 times a day, she whispered, her voice breaking. "You saved me. Now." She had to save him, even if it meant destroying herself. The heat that afternoon was not merely a temperature. It was a physical weight, pressing down on the high plains until the very air seemed to liquefy above the baking earth. Luke McKenna rode in from the far pasture, his shirt plastered to his back, his face coated in a mask of gray dust. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding, hung its head, its breathing laboring in the stifling stillness. Luke had spent the last 6 hours mending a break in the drift fence, stretching barbed wire until his gloves were shredded and his hands bled. Every muscle in his body ached with a deep, throbbing fatigue. But as the ranch house came into view, a different kind of tension seized him. The chimney was cold. No smoke curled from the stack, though it was time to start the fire for the evening meal. The front door stood slightly ajar, swaying imperceptibly in the hot breeze. "Eve?" Luke called out as he swung down from the saddle. His boots crunched loud on the gravel. There was no answer. The silence of the house was not the peaceful quiet of rest. It was the hollow, echoing silence of abandonment. He took the porch steps 2 at a time and pushed the door open. The main room was empty. The coffee pot was cold on the stove. He strode to the bedroom door and threw it open. The room was immaculate. The bed was made with a precision that Eve had never managed before. The quilt pulled tight and smooth. The wash basin was dry. Her small carpet bag, which usually sat at the foot of the bed, was gone. Panic did not creep up on Luke. It slammed into him like a physical blow to the gut. He spun around, searching for a note, a sign, anything. There was nothing, just the brutal cleanliness of a space that had been wiped of a presence. She had done what she threatened. She had left to save him. "No," Luke growled, the sound tearing from his throat. He ran back out to the porch. He scanned the horizon, squinting against the glare. There were fresh wagon tracks on the main road, deep ruts cut into the dust by a heavy freight wagon that must have passed within the hour. She had caught a ride, and there was only one place she would go to ensure he was clear of her debt. Luke vaulted onto his tired horse. He did not spare the animal, though it pained him to drive it so hard in the heat. He spurred the gelding into a gallop, thundering out of the yard and onto the road toward Benton Creek. The ride was a blur of dust and adrenaline. The wind rushed past his ears, hot as the breath from an oven. The sky above was a blank, ruthless blue, indifferent to the man racing beneath it. Luke pushed the horse, his mind replaying every conversation, every look, every moment he had failed to tell her that she was not a burden. He had been too careful, too respectful, and in doing so, he had let her believe that his silence was regret. He reached the outskirts of Benton Creek in record time. The horse was foaming, its sides heaving. As he pulled it up in front of the Golden Garter, Luke did not bother to tie the reins. He threw them over the hitching rail and shoved through the batwing doors. The transition from the blinding sun to the dim interior was jarring. Luke blinked, his eyes adjusting to the smoky gloom. The saloon was quiet, the afternoon crowd consisting of a few slump-shouldered drinkers at the bar and a card game in the corner. But Luke saw only one thing. At a table near the back wall, Eve sat. She was sitting with her back straight, her hands folded too neatly on the scarred wood in front of her. She wore the bonnet he had seen her mend, but it hung loosely around her neck now. Her face was pale, almost translucent in the dim light, but her jaw was set. Standing behind her, leaning against the wall with a proprietary air, was Cade. His hand rested on the back of her chair, inches from her shoulder, a gesture of ownership that made Luke's blood boil. Luke strode across the room, his spurs jingling. "Eve, get up! We are leaving!" Eve looked up. Her eyes were wide, shining with unshed tears, but she did not move. "I cannot go. Luke, I am home. You are not home," Luke said, stopping at the edge of the table. "This is not a home. It is a cage. Get up. I came back to settle things," Eve said, her voice steady though her fingers were twisting together in her lap. "I owe a debt. I am paying it. You are free of it. Luke, go back to the ranch." Cade laughed. It was a low, rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "Listen to the lady. McKenna. She knows where she belongs." "You keep your mouth shut," Luke snarled, not looking at the saloon owner. "Eve, look at me. You do not have to do this. I told you, I picked this trouble. I will not let you lose everything for me," Eve cried out, her composure cracking. "Look at you, Luke. You are half dead from working. The town hates you. The bank is coming. If I stay, you lose the land. If I am here. Cade tears up the note. "Is that the deal?" Luke looked at Cade with disgust. "You trade her life for a piece of paper?" Cade pushed himself off the wall. He smoothed his vest, a smirk playing on his lips. "There is no deal, rancher." "Because there is no debt anymore." "What are you talking about?" Luke asked, narrowing his eyes. "I am talking about the law," Cade said. "Sheriff!" The door to the back office opened, and Sheriff Miller stepped out. He had his gun drawn, the barrel leveled at Luke's chest. "Luke McKenna," Miller said, his voice flat. "You are under arrest." "For what?" Luke demanded, his hands curling into fists. "Abduction," Miller said. "An assault. Mister, Cade here swears a complaint that you came into his establishment weeks ago, assaulted his employees, and forcibly removed Miss Harrington against her will. He claims you have been holding her prisoner at your ranch, using her as you saw fit. That is a lie," Luke shouted. He took a step toward Miller, but the sheriff cocked the hammer of the revolver. "Another step, and I put a hole in you. Luke!" Eve jumped to her feet, knocking her chair over. "No, that is not true. I went with him. He paid for me." Cade clamped a hand onto Eve's shoulder, forcing her back down. His grip was brutal. "Quiet, darling. You are confused. The drugs, they mess with the memory." He looked at Luke, his eyes cold and dead. "You see how it is? McKenna, a respectable businessman, says you kidnapped his property. A drug-addled whore says, well, who cares what she says? The court will look at you, broke, desperate, living like a savage, and they will look at me. Who do you think they will believe?" Luke looked at Eve. She was shaking her head, terror dawning in her eyes as she realized the trap she had walked into. She had come back to sacrifice herself, but Cade did not want a sacrifice. He wanted a victory. He wanted to crush them both. "Turn around. Luke," Miller ordered. "Hands behind your back." Luke hesitated. He looked at the gun, then at Eve. If he fought, he might get a shot off. But Miller would shoot him, or worse, the stray bullet might hit Eve. The room was too small, and the odds were too stacked. He slowly turned around. Miller holstered his gun and grabbed Luke's wrists, snapping a pair of heavy iron cuffs onto them. The metal bit into Luke's skin, grinding against the bone. "Take him to the cell," Cade said, pouring himself a drink. "I need to have a word with my girl." Luke struggled as Miller shoved him toward the door. "Eve, do not say anything. Do not let him twist it." Eve watched him go, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. As the door swung shut behind Luke and the sheriff, the silence in the saloon returned, heavy and suffocating. Cade turned to her. He picked up his glass of whiskey and took a slow sip, watching her over the rim. "Now," he said softly, "let us discuss the future." Eve stood up, her legs trembling. "I will tell them, Cade. I will tell the judge you are lying. Luke never touched me. He saved me." Cade sighed. He walked around the table and stood close to her, invading her space until she could smell the tobacco and bay rum on his skin. "You can tell them that," he said, "and maybe, just maybe, one or two people might believe you, but here's the reality. Eve, the sheriff has charged him with abduction. In this territory, stealing a man's property is a hanging offense. Assaulting a citizen is 5 years in the territorial prison." He leaned in, whispering in her ear, "If you go into that court and tell the truth, I will make sure they hang him. I will bring in witnesses who will swear they saw him drag you out screaming. I will pay the judge if I have to. Luke McKenna will dance at the end of a rope, and you will watch." Eve felt the blood drain from her face. She gripped the edge of the table to keep from falling. "What do you want?" she whispered. "I want my reputation back," Cade said. "I want this town to know that no one takes from me. So here is the bargain. You go into that courtroom, and you testify. You tell them Luke McKenna forced you. You tell them he dragged you to that ranch and kept you there. You tell them you escaped and came back to me for protection." Eve's stomach roiled. "You want me to lie. You want me to destroy him. If you do," Cade continued, ignoring her distress, "I will ask the judge for leniency. I will say I am a merciful man. Luke will get a year in prison, maybe 2. He keeps his life. He loses the ranch, of course, but he keeps his neck. And if I don't, then he hangs next Tuesday." Cade stepped back, smiling his lazy, dangerous smile. "It is up to you. Eve, save him 3 times a day, right? Well, here's your chance. Save his life by killing his name." Eve stared at him, horror cold in her veins. He wanted her broken. He wanted her to be the instrument of Luke's destruction. He wanted to prove that love was just another weakness he could exploit. "I need to see him," she said, her voice hollow. Cade shrugged. "Go ahead, say your goodbyes. Convince him to take the plea, because if he fights me, he dies." Night had fallen over Benton Creek. The wind had died down, leaving the town wrapped in a stifling, dusty silence. The only sound was the distant, mournful whistle of a train crossing the trestle miles to the east, a sound that spoke of places far away and lives lived in freedom. The jailhouse was a small stone building at the end of the street. It smelled of damp earth, unwashed bodies, and the sharp, metallic tang of rust. A single kerosene lantern burned on the sheriff's desk, casting long, jumping shadows against the walls. Sheriff Miller looked up as Eve entered. He looked bored. 5 minutes, he grunted. "Keep the noise down." He unlocked the heavy oak door leading to the cells and jerked his head. Eve walked through. There were 2 cells. Luke was in the far one. He was sitting on the narrow cot, his head in his hands. He looked up as she approached. His face was bruised. Miller must have roughed him up during the booking, and his shirt was torn. "Eve," he breathed, standing up and coming to the bars. "Are you hurt?" Did he touch you?" "No," Eve whispered. She gripped the cold iron bars, her fingers turning white. "I am fine." Luke searched her face in the gloom. "Why did you do it? Why did you leave?" I looked at the bank letter. "Luke, I looked at you. You were dying by inches for me. I thought if I removed the burden, you could float. You are not a burden." Luke's voice was fierce, echoing in the small stone room. "You are the only thing that has made this drought bearable. You are the reason I get up in the morning." Eve closed her eyes, tears leaking out to track through the dust on her cheeks. Cade gave me a choice. "Luke, he says if I testify that you kidnapped me, if I say you forced me, he will let you off with prison time. If I tell the truth, he will see you hanged." Luke's hands shot out through the bars and grabbed her wrists. "No, do not you do it! Eve, do not you dare! He will kill you!" Eve sobbed, opening her eyes. "I cannot let him kill you. I can lie. Luke, I can say whatever they want. I do not care what they think of me. I just want you to live. I do not want a life bought with your shame." Luke shook her gently. "Listen to me. If you lie, Cade wins. He owns you again. He owns the truth. I would rather swing knowing you stood tall than live knowing you knelt for me. But the ranch, to hell with the ranch." Luke's voice cracked. "It is dirt and grass. Eve, it is nothing without you." He pulled her closer until her face was pressed against the bars. The iron was cold against her cheek, but his hands were warm. "I chose you," he whispered. "I chose this trouble. Do not take that choice away from me. We tell the truth, no matter what." Eve looked into his eyes. They were blue and bloodshot and filled with a desperate, terrifying love. He was willing to die rather than let her demean herself. He was offering her dignity at the cost of his own life. The wall inside her, the wall of shame and fear she had built for years, crumbled. "I love you," she whispered. The words came out broken, surprised by their own existence. Luke went still. "Say it again. I love you. Luke." He leaned forward, pressing his forehead against the bars. "Then kiss me." Eve leaned in. The bars pressed hard against her face, bruising the skin, but she didn't care. She turned her head, seeking him, and their lips met through the gap in the cold metal. It was not a gentle kiss. It was desperate. It tasted of salt from her tears and the rusty iron of the cell. It tasted of dust and fear. But beneath it all, it tasted of life. It was a claiming. It was a promise. Luke's hands released her wrists and cupped her face, his thumbs wiping away the tears, his fingers tangling in her hair. For a moment, the jail, the sheriff, and Cade didn't exist. There was only the heat of their breath and the fierce, defiant beat of their hearts. When they pulled apart, breathless, Eve's eyes were clear. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp anger. "I am not going to lie," she said, her voice steady and hard. "And I am not just going to defend you." "What are you going to do?" Luke asked. "I am going to burn him down," Eve said. "I know where he keeps the books. I know where the girls come from. I know which wagons bring the laudanum. I know it all. Luke, I was too scared to speak before. I was too numb." She gripped the bars again. "I am going to tell the judge everything. Not just about us, about Cade, about the ring, about the girls who didn't make it out." Luke looked at her with a mixture of pride and terror. "That is dangerous. Eve, Cade will try to stop you." "Let him try," she said. "He thinks I am property. He thinks I am weak. He forgot that I survived him for 3 years. Sheriff Miller's voice bellowed from the outer room. "Time is up. Get out of there." Eve reached through the bars one last time and squeezed Luke's hand. "Save me," she whispered. "Morning, noon, and night," Luke answered, squeezing back. She turned and walked out of the cell block. She did not look back. She walked past the sheriff, past the desk, and out into the night air. She did not go to the hotel. She went to the livery stable, found a corner in the hayloft, and curled up to wait for dawn. She did not sleep. She sharpened the blade of her resolve. The morning broke gray and sullen. The sun was hidden behind a haze of high, thin clouds that promised no rain, only heat. Benton Creek was already awake. Word had spread. The trial was to be held at the county seat, a day's ride away, where the circuit judge was sitting. The town buzzed with the scandal. The rancher and the whore, the kidnapping. Cade stood outside the Golden Garter, dressed in his finest suit, looking every inch the aggrieved businessman. Sheriff Miller brought Luke out of the jail. Luke was in chains. Heavy irons bound his ankles, forcing him to shuffle, and his wrists were manacled to a chain around his waist. He looked haggard, but his head was high. He scanned the crowd until he saw Eve. She was mounted on a borrowed horse, the livery owner. An old man who disliked Cade had lent her a mare out of pity, or perhaps a secret desire to see Cade fall. She sat straight in the saddle, her face pale but composed. "Get in the wagon. McKenna!" Miller shoved Luke toward a buckboard. Luke climbed in awkwardly, the chains clanking. He sat on the floorboards, his back against the side. Miller climbed onto the bench, a shotgun across his knees. Cade mounted a black stallion, flanked by his 2 hired thugs. "Let's move," Cade commanded. The procession started. Cade and his men took the lead, followed by the wagon carrying the prisoner. Eve fell in behind, alone. The wind picked up as they left the shelter of the town. It blew hard from the north, stinging Eve's eyes and lips with grit. The landscape was desolate, dry riverbeds that looked like scars on the earth, brittle grass that hissed in the wind, and the endless, oppressive sky. Eve kept her eyes on Luke's back. She could see the way he braced himself against the jolts of the wagon. She could see the tension in his shoulders. They were riding into the lion's den. Cade had money, influence, and the sheriff. They had nothing but the truth and a love that had been forged in the fires of withdrawal and drought. Eve reached into her pocket and touched the small, smooth stone she had picked up from the creek bed at the ranch weeks ago. It was her anchor. She looked at the horizon. The county seat was miles away. The road would be hard, but she was not turning back. If Cade wanted a fight, she would give him a war. And if they went down, they would go down standing side by side. She kicked the mare into a trot, closing the distance until she was riding in the dust of Luke's wagon, her shadow stretching out long and thin across the unforgiving land. The county seat of Granite Peak sat huddled at the base of the foothills, a rough collection of timber and adobe buildings pressed against a backdrop of distant, snow-tipped mountains. It was a place where the law was bought and sold as casually as cattle, and the streets were churned into a permanent slurry of dust and manure by the constant traffic of heavy freight wagons and saddle horses. The wagon carrying Luke McKenna rattled over the rutted main street, the chains around his ankles clanking with a dull, rhythmic heaviness that matched the pounding of his heart. Eve rode behind, her mare stepping nervously in the chaotic traffic. She kept her head high. Though she could feel the eyes of the town on her, news of the trial had outpaced them, carried on the wind and the telegraph wires. The sidewalks were lined with men in dusty coats and women in stiff, severe dresses, their face masks of eager judgment. They had come for a show. They had come to see the saloon whore and the fool rancher who had thrown his life away for her. The courthouse was the largest building in town, a 2-story structure of red brick that looked out of place amidst the gray wood of the surrounding saloons and stables. Inside, the air was thick and stale, smelling of unwashed wool, tobacco smoke, and the nervous sweat of the accused. The courtroom itself was dim, lit only by high, dusty windows that allowed shafts of mote-filled light to pierce the gloom. The benches were packed, every seat was taken, and men stood lining the back walls, whispering behind their hands. The buzz of conversation was a low, insect-like drone. "I heard he kept her chained in the cellar," a woman in the front row whispered to her neighbor, loud enough for Eve to hear as she walked down the center aisle. "I heard she bewitched him with opium," the neighbor replied, pulling her shawl tighter as Eve passed. "Look at her. You can see the sin in her eyes." Eve walked to the front of the room, her boots echoing on the floorboards. She wore the plain calico dress Luke had given her, washed and pressed, but the sleeves were too short to fully hide the fading yellow bruises on her wrists, marks left by Cade, not Luke. She sat on a hard wooden bench behind the defendant's table, her back rigid. Luke was led to the table by Sheriff Miller. The sheriff shoved him into the chair, the chains rattling loudly in the sudden silence. Luke looked smaller here than he ever did on the open range. The walls seemed to press in on him, shrinking the man who was used to horizons that stretched forever. He did not look at the crowd. He looked only at Eve, his eyes offering a silent apology for the spectacle. The judge, a weary man named Harrison with ink-stained fingers and a face that looked like melted wax, banged his gavel. He looked at the papers before him with an expression of profound boredom mixed with irritation. "All rise," the bailiff droned. Judge Harrison sat, and the room settled into a rustling silence. He peered over his spectacles at the defense table. "Luke McKenna, you are charged with abduction, assault, and holding a woman against her will. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," Luke said, his voice rough but steady. "We shall see," Harrison muttered. He glanced at the prosecution table, where Cade sat with a lawyer from the city, a man in a slick suit who looked like a predatory bird. Sheriff Miller took the stand first. He strutted as he walked, his thumbs hooked in his gun belt, basking in the attention. He painted a picture of Luke that Eve barely recognized. He described Luke as a violent loner, a man driven mad by isolation and drought, who had stormed into a peaceful establishment and dragged a helpless, hysterical woman out into the wilderness. She was screaming, "Your Honor, Miller lied." His face the picture of earnest concern. She was begging for help. But McKenna here, he had a look in his eye, a crazy look, and the woman, well, Miss Harrington is known to have a delicate constitution. She is an addict, sir. She cannot make choices for herself. She needs a strong hand to guide her. The crowd murmured their agreement. It was a story they understood. The savage rancher and the fallen woman. It fit their world. Then Cade took the stand. He was smooth. He spoke with the quiet confidence of a man who owned the mortgage on half the buildings in town. He expressed deep regret, looking at Luke with a pitying shake of his head. "I only wanted to protect her," Cade told the jury, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "Eve has had a hard life. I took her in when no one else would. I gave her a roof, a job, medicine for her nerves. When McKenna took her, I feared for her life. I knew he would use her. I knew he would keep her as his own personal entertainment out on that God-forsaken ranch." He turned to look at Eve, his eyes cold and dead despite the smile on his lips. "I just want her back where she is safe. Your Honor, that is all." Luke's hands clenched into fists on the table, the knuckles white. He made a move to stand, but his lawyer, a court-appointed drunkard who smelled of gin, put a hand on his arm to restrain him. The prosecution rested. It was Eve's turn. "Call Eve Harrington," the bailiff shouted. The room seemed to tilt as Eve stood up. Her legs felt like water. The walk to the witness stand felt miles long. She could feel every eye on her, the men undressing her with their gazes, the women condemning her with their piety. The old urge to run, to find the nearest bottle of laudanum and drown the world in gray fog, clawed at her mind with terrifying strength. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She sat in the witness chair. The wood was hard and polished by the fear of 1,000 people before her. "State your name," the judge said. "Eve Harrington." She whispered. "Speak up, girl," the judge snapped. "Eve Harrington," she said, her voice cracking. She looked out at the sea of faces. She saw the contempt. She saw the hunger for scandal. Then she looked at Luke. He was watching her, and in his eyes, there was no judgment. There was only the same steady, quiet patience he had shown her through the vomiting and the nightmares. He believed in her. She took a deep breath. The air tasted of dust, but it also tasted of truth. "Tell the court what happened," Luke's lawyer mumbled. Leaning against the railing, Eve gripped the arms of the chair. "I am not a victim of Luke McKenna," she began, her voice shaking but gaining strength. "And Mr. Cade is not my protector." She turned to face the jury. "I was the daughter of a doctor in St. Louis. When he died, He left debts. Cade bought those debts. He told me I could work them off. He brought me here. Murmurs rippled through the room. This was not the story they expected. I worked in his saloon, Eve continued. The words tumbling out now, I poured drinks, I played the piano, and when that wasn't enough to pay the interest, he added every month. He forced me to do other things. She swallowed the bile rising in her throat. The shame burned her skin. But she did not look away. I started taking laudanum because it was the only way I could endure it. I begged for it. I begged for it to make the nights go away. I became exactly what you all think I am. A junkie. A whore. The word hung in the air. Stark and brutal. The courtroom went deadly silent. But Luke McKenna did not kidnap me, she said, her voice ringing clear now. He bought me. He gave Cade every cent he had, money he needed for his cattle, to pay a debt that was already a lie. She turned her gaze to Cade. He was staring at her, his face darkening, the mask of the benevolent businessman slipping. And he never touched me, Eve said. Not once. He took me to his ranch and he sat with me while I screamed and shook. He cleaned up my sickness. He held my hand while the poison left my body. He saved me. Morning, noon, and night. Objection, Cade's lawyer shouted, jumping up. This is irrelevant. The witness is a known addict. Her testimony is unreliable. Overruled, the judge said, leaning forward. He looked intrigued. Continue. Miss Harrington? Eve looked at the sheriff. And it is not just me. There are crates that come in on the midnight wagons. They are marked as whiskey, but they are full of laudanum bottles. And there are girls who come from the east, thinking they have jobs waiting. Cade takes their papers. He locks them in the rooms upstairs. If they try to leave, the sheriff brings them back. Lies, the sheriff bellowed, his face turning purple. Sit down. Sheriff, the judge barked. Eve did not stop. She told them about the threats. She told them about the girl named Clara who had disappeared 2 months ago after refusing to service a wealthy cattle buyer. She told them about the network of exploitation that lay beneath the polite veneer of Cade's business. When she finished, she was trembling, drained of everything but the truth. Cade's lawyer approached the stand like a wolf circling a wounded deer. He sneered at her. You say, Mr. McKenna never touched you. Miss Harrington? He asked, his voice oily. A man pays $180 for a woman of your profession, and he never touches her. Do you expect this court to believe that? It is the truth, Eve said. Or perhaps, the lawyer suggested, leaning in close, you are so used to selling yourself that you do not know the difference between kindness and payment? How many men have you been with, Miss Harrington? 10, 20, 100? Eve flinched as if he had struck her. The cruelty of the question stole her breath. The courtroom buzzed again, the titillation of the scandal overriding the horror of her testimony. Answer the question, the lawyer demanded. Eve looked down at her hands. The tears threatened to spill over. She was breaking. The shame was too heavy. Then she looked up and locked eyes with Luke. He gave a nearly imperceptible nod. I am here, his eyes said. You are not alone. Eve lifted her chin. I have been with enough men to know the difference between a man who wants to use me and a man who wants to save me, she said, her voice cutting through the noise. And Luke McKenna is the only man who ever asked for nothing? The lawyer opened his mouth to attack again, but a movement in the back of the room stopped him. A tall man in a long gray coat stood up. He had been sitting quietly near the door, unnoticed. He walked down the aisle, the crowd parting for him. He wore a silver badge on his vest that caught the light. United States Marshal, the man announced, his voice carrying effortlessly. Your Honor, I would like a word. The judge blinked, wiping sweat from his forehead. Marshal, this is a local matter. I believe Miss Harrington just described a violation of several federal laws regarding interstate commerce and trafficking, the marshal said. Stepping up to the bar, I have been tracking a shipment of illicit laudanum from Chicago for 3 months. It seems I have found where it ends up. He looked at Cade. Cade had gone pale. He whispered something to his lawyer, who looked equally nervous. The judge looked from Cade to the marshal to the angry, confused crowd. He was a political creature, and he knew which way the wind was blowing. The federal government was a much bigger threat than a local saloon owner. This court, the judge cleared his throat. This court will take a recess. 2 hours later, the ruling came down. In light of the new information and the pending federal investigation, the judge announced, striking his gavel, the charges against Luke McKenna are suspended. He is released on his own recognizance, but he must remain within the county until the marshal has concluded his inquiry into Mr. Cade and Sheriff Miller. It was not a full exoneration, but it was freedom. Luke stood up. Sheriff Miller, looking sullen and fearful under the marshal's watchful eye, unlocked the chains. The iron fell to the floor with a clang that sounded like a church bell to Eve's ears. Luke rubbed his wrists, the skin raw and red. He walked over to Eve and offered her his hand. She took it, and for the first time in front of the town, he pulled her close, wrapping his arm around her shoulders in a protective embrace. "Let's go home," he said. They walked out of the courthouse together. The crowd, cowed by the presence of the marshal and the sudden turn of events, parted to let them through. No one whispered. They just watched, sensing that the power in the town had shifted, if only for a moment. But as they stepped out onto the street, the weather had turned. The bright, relentless sun of the morning was gone. The sky was a churning mass of slate-gray clouds that hung low over the mountains, obscuring the peaks. The wind had picked up, cold and biting, smelling of ozone and ice. It was a sudden, violent shift typical of the high country, where a summer day could turn into a winter storm in the span of hours. "We need to beat that weather," Luke said, looking at the sky with a rancher's wary eye. They retrieved their horses, Luke's gelding and Eve's borrowed mare. They rode out of Granite Peak as the first gusts of wind kicked up blinding clouds of dust. The ride back to the ranch was a race against the elements. The temperature dropped plummeting. The wind howled across the open plains, stripping the heat from their bodies. They were 5 miles from the ranch, entering a narrow ravine known as Dead Man's Cut, when the world exploded. The ravine was a jagged scar in the earth, lined with boulders and scrub brush. The road narrowed here, twisting between high rock walls. The crack of a rifle shot echoed off the stone before the sound even registered. Luke's horse reared, screaming. A second shot kicked up dirt inches from the horse's hooves. "Ambush!" Luke shouted. He looked up. High on the rim of the ravine, silhouetted against the gray sky, were 3 figures. Cade's men. Cade hadn't waited for the law. He had decided to settle the debt the old way. "Get down!" Luke yelled. He grabbed the bridle of Eve's mare and yanked it hard, forcing the horse toward the shelter of a large overhang of rock. Another shot rang out. Eve felt the wind of the bullet pass her cheek. Luke shoved her, hard. She flew out of the saddle, hitting the dirt and rolling behind a boulder. "Stay down," Luke roared. He wheeled his horse around, drawing the rifle from his saddle scabbard. He was a target in the open, drawing their fire away from Eve. A bullet struck him. Eve saw his body jerk violently. A bloom of red appeared on his left shoulder, soaking through his shirt instantly. He groaned, the sound lost in the wind, but he did not fall. He raised his rifle with one arm and returned fire. Bang! One of the men on the ridge cried out and disappeared from view. Luke spurred his horse, zigzagging across the ravine floor, firing again. He was riding like a man possessed, a demon on horseback, trading blood for time. The attackers, surprised by the ferocity of his defense and the accuracy of his one-armed shooting, ducked for cover. "Ride, Eve!" Luke shouted, his voice strained with pain. "Ride for the ranch! I am not leaving you!" she screamed back, scrambling to her feet. She grabbed the reins of her mare, which was dancing in terror, and vaulted into the saddle. She did not ride away. She rode toward him. Luke saw her coming. He looked at her with wild, desperate eyes, but he didn't argue. He turned his horse and they galloped out of the mouth of the ravine together, leaving the ambushers behind in the dust and the confusion. They rode hard. The horses were blowing, their hooves pounding a frantic rhythm on the hard-packed earth. Luke was swaying in the saddle. His left arm hung useless at his side, blood dripping from his fingertips to leave a dark trail in the dust. The storm broke. It did not start with rain. It started with sleet, hard, stinging pellets of ice that drove sideways in the wind. Then came the snow, heavy and wet, blotting out the world in a swirling curtain of white. "Luke," Eve called out, bringing her horse alongside his. "I am fine," Luke gasped. "Keep riding." His face was the color of ash. His eyes were unfocused. The loss of blood and the shock were taking their toll. "We are almost there," Eve said, though she couldn't see the ranch house through the storm. "Just hold on. I picked this." "Trouble," Luke mumbled, his words slurring. They crested the last low hill. Below them, through the driving snow, the dark shape of the ranch house appeared like a ship on a stormy sea. "Thank God," Eve breathed. They clattered into the yard. The wind was howling now, a banshee wail that tore at their clothes. Luke pulled his horse to a halt near the porch. He sat there for a moment, staring at the door of the house he had built, the house he had fought to keep. "Luke?" Eve dismounted and ran to his side. "Luke, we made it! Get down!" Luke looked down at her. He blinked, trying to clear the fog from his vision. He smiled, a weak, lopsided thing. "3 times," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "What?" Eve asked, reaching up to grab his leg to steady him. "Still owe you 1 saving. For the night." His eyes rolled back in his head. "Luke!" He toppled from the saddle. There was no grace in it. He fell like a cut tree, crashing into the cold, muddy ground at her feet. "Luke!" Eve screamed, falling to her knees beside him. She turned him over. His shirt was soaked with blood, a dark, spreading stain that looked black in the dim light. The snow fell on his face. Not melting. He was unconscious. His breathing was shallow and ragged. Eve looked around. The world was white and cold and empty. There was no doctor. There was no marshal. There was only the storm, the dying man, and the woman who had promised to save him. She grabbed him by the collar of his coat. She dug her heels into the mud. "You are not dying. Luke McKenna," she hissed through her teeth. "You are not leaving me." She began to pull. Panic seized Eve Harrington's chest, a cold iron band tighter than any corset she had ever worn. The wind whipped her hair across her face, blinding her for a second, stinging her eyes with grit and ice. She fell to her knees in the mud beside the fallen horse, her hands landing in the slurry of earth and snow. "Luke!" she screamed, the sound torn away instantly by the gale. He did not move. He lay crumpled on his side, one leg twisted beneath him, his face turned toward the darkening sky. The snow was falling faster now, wet and heavy, hissing as it hit the ground. Eve scrambled to him, her fingers slipping on the slick leather of his coat. She rolled him onto his back. His face was gray, the color of wet ash, and his eyes were closed. Blood, dark and thick, pulsed sluggishly from the hole in his shoulder, staining the snow beneath him a terrifying crimson. He was heavy. He was a man built of hard work and muscle, dead weight in his unconsciousness. Eve was thin, her strength only recently returned after weeks of proper food. But as she looked at him, the man who had sat with her through the hell of withdrawal, the man who had ridden into a hail of bullets for her, fear turned into a frantic, white-hot resolve. She grabbed him under the arms. She dug her boots into the freezing mud. She pulled. He moved an inch, then another. "Get up! Luke!" she gritted out, her teeth clenched so hard her jaw ached. "You do not get to die in the dirt. I will not let you." She dragged him. It was a battle of inches. The porch seemed a mile away. Her breath came in ragged gasps that burned her lungs. Her boots slipped, and she fell hard, skinning her palms, but she scrambled back up without pausing. She hauled him up the low steps, the wood slick with ice, his boots thumping heavily against the risers. By the time she got him across the threshold and into the main room, she was sobbing with exertion. She kicked the door shut against the howling wind and collapsed for a moment, her chest heaving. The house was cold, but it was out of the wind. She scrambled to her feet. There was no time to rest. She dragged him to the bed near the stove. She could not lift him onto it. Instead, she pulled the mattress off the frame and onto the floor, then rolled him onto it. She lit the kerosene lamp, her hands shaking so badly she wasted 3 matches. The golden light flared, illuminating the damage. His shirt was soaked through on the left side. Eve ran to the kitchen drawer. She grabbed the butcher knife. She grabbed a bottle of whiskey from the cupboard. Luke rarely drank it, but he kept it for the horses or for disinfecting. She knelt beside him and cut the shirt away. The fabric stuck to the wound, and she had to peel it back. The bullet had gone deep into the muscle of the shoulder. It was still in there. She could see the dark, puckered entry wound, oozing fresh blood with every beat of his heart. She poured whiskey over the wound. Luke's body jerked, a low groan escaping his throat, but his eyes did not open. "I am sorry," Eve whispered, tears blurring her vision. "I am so sorry. Luke." She poured whiskey over the blade of the knife and thrust it into the flames of the stove until the metal turned dull and hot. She had watched her father do this once, years ago, on a man who had been kicked by a mule. She remembered the smell. She remembered the sound. She took a deep breath, wiped her eyes with her sleeve, and leaned over him. "I have to get it out," she told his unconscious face. "You have to be brave for me one more time." She probed the wound. The knife scraped against something hard, bone or lead. She did not know. Luke thrashed, his right hand flying up to grip her wrist with bruising force. His eyes flew open, unseeing, glazed with agony. "No!" he roared, a guttural sound of pure pain. "Shh, shh, it is me," Eve sobbed, but she did not stop. She held his arm down with her knee and dug deeper. The sickening squelch of flesh, the grate of metal on lead, the smell of singed skin and blood filled the small room. Nausea roiled in her stomach, threatening to empty her, but she swallowed it down. She was not the delicate flower of St. Louis anymore. She was a woman of the high plains, and she had work to do. "Got it," she gasped. With a flick of her wrist, the flattened piece of lead popped out, landing with a tiny clink on the floorboards. Fresh blood welled up. Eve grabbed a clean towel and pressed it down hard. Luke's thrashing subsided into whimpers, then back into a heavy, terrifying silence. She bound the wound tightly with strips of clean linen. She covered him with every quilt in the house. Then she sat back on her heels, her hands covered in his blood, and stared at him. The storm outside broke in full force. It was no longer just snow. It was a blizzard. The wind shrieked like a banshee, tearing at the shingles, burying the world in white. They were cut off. No doctor could get through, no sheriff, no Cade. They were utterly alone. And for the first time, Eve realized the terrifying truth. He had saved her. Now, the debt had reversed. She washed the blood from her hands in the basin, the water turning pink. She stoked the fire until the stove glowed cherry red. She pulled a chair close to the mattress on the floor. She did not sleep that night. She listened to his breathing. It was fast and shallow. By morning, the fever had set in. A new routine began, born of necessity and fear. At dawn, when the gray light filtered through the frosted windows, Eve changed the bandages. She boiled water, washed the angry red skin around the stitches she had clumsily sewn, and checked for the dark lines of infection. "Morning saving," she whispered, smoothing the hair back from his burning forehead. At midday, she made a thin broth from dried beef and water. She lifted his heavy head into her lap and coaxed him to drink. He was delirious, muttering about fences and rain and the price of cattle. He fought her sometimes, turning his head away, but she was relentless. "Drink, Luke, please, for me." She stroked his throat until he swallowed. Noon saving. At night, the demons came, not his, but hers. The nights were the hardest. The wind never stopped. The isolation pressed in on the cabin walls, squeezing the air out of the room. Luke would toss and turn, crying out in his sleep, fighting invisible enemies. Eve sat by him, holding his hand, singing soft lullabies she hadn't thought of since childhood. But as the fatigue wore her down, the old hunger woke up. It started as a scratch at the back of her mind. "Just a little," the voice whispered. "To take the edge off, to help you sleep. You cannot take care of him if you collapse." Her hands began to shake. Not from cold, but from the want. Her skin felt too tight. Her stomach cramped. The stress of the surgery. The fear of him dying. The smell of the blood. It all triggered the deep, lizard brain need for the warm blanket of laudanum. On the third night, it became unbearable. Luke was quiet for once, sunk into a deep, comatose slumber. The house was silent except for the wind. Eve was pacing. She felt like she was going to shatter. She needed it. She needed it more than she needed air. She went to her carpet bag. She had emptied it days ago, but she knew the lining had a tear. Her fingers fumbled in the dark fabric. There, a small, amber vial. It had slipped into the seam months ago and been forgotten. She pulled it out. The liquid caught the firelight, glowing like trapped honey. It was salvation. It was peace. It was the end of fear. Eve uncorked it. The smell, bitter, earthy, sweet, wafted up, and her knees went weak. She brought it to her lips. "Just one sip," she told herself. "Just to steady my hands." She closed her eyes, tilting her head back. "Eve." The sound was barely a whisper, a rasp of dry air over vocal cords. Eve froze. She opened her eyes. Luke had shifted. His eyes were open, slits of blue in a face of chalk. He was looking at her. His hand, the one not bound to his chest, was reaching out blindly across the quilt, his fingers curled, searching for something to hold on to. Eve stared at him. She stared at the bottle in her hand. If she took it, she would float away. She would be safe in the numbness, but she would not be here. If he woke up, if he needed water, if the fire went out, she would be gone, lost in the fog. He had ridden into a ravine for her. He had taken a bullet for her. He had sat in a chair for nights on end, fighting his own desire for whiskey, just to hold her hand. If she drank this, she was not just killing herself. She was killing him. Tears spilled hot and fast down her cheeks. She looked at the vial one last time. It promised her heaven, but Luke promised her a life. "No," she whispered. She strode to the stove. She threw the vial into the open grate. The glass shattered. The liquid hit the hot coals and hissed violently, a cloud of acrid white smoke billowing up the chimney. The smell of burning opium filled the room for a second, then was sucked away by the draft. Eve sank to the floor beside the mattress. She took Luke's searching hand in hers and pressed it to her wet cheek. "I am here," she sobbed. "I am here. Luke, I am not going back. Outside." The coyotes howled, close and hungry, but inside, the ghost was dead. 2 days later, the fever broke. It happened in the early morning. Eve had fallen asleep with her head on the mattress. She woke to the feeling of movement. Luke was trying to sit up. He was weak as a kitten, his arms trembling, but his eyes were clear. The glassy look of delirium was gone. "Eve?" His voice was a croak. "Luke!" She pushed him gently back down. "Do not move. You will tear the stitches." He looked around the room, confused. He looked at the bandages on his shoulder, then at Eve's gaunt, exhausted face. Memory flooded back into his eyes. "The ambush," he rasped. "I fell." "Yes," Eve said, pouring him a cup of water. "You fell. I promised," he whispered, looking away, shame coloring his pale cheeks. "I promised I would be the strong one. I promised I would save you, and I collapsed in the mud like a fool. I failed you. Eve." Eve set the cup down. She placed her hands on either side of his face, forcing him to look at her. "You listen to me. Luke McKenna," she said fiercely. "You did not fail me. You took a bullet for me. You got us home. But you had to. I had to save you," she finished. "And I did. I dragged you in. I cut the bullet out. I kept you alive." She let out a shaky laugh that sounded like a sob. "Do you know why? Because you taught me how. You showed me that I was worth saving. So I decided you were worth saving too." Luke looked at her. really looked at her. He saw the circles under her eyes, the burns on her fingers from the stove, the strength in her jaw. He didn't see the broken girl from the saloon anymore. He saw a woman who had walked through fire. "Thank you," he whispered. "Don't thank me yet," she smiled, wiping a tear from his cheek. "I made soup, and it is terrible." The thaw came slowly. The snow retreated, leaving the world a muddy, brown mess. Luke's strength returned in increments. The first day he could sit up. The first day he could stand. The first day he could walk to the porch. 3 weeks after the ambush, a rider appeared. It was not Cade. It was the federal marshal, flanked by 2 deputies. He rode into the yard, his horse kicking up divots of mud. Eve met him on the porch, a Winchester rifle in her hands. She wasn't taking chances anymore. "Mrs. Harrington," the marshal called out, tipping his hat. "Or is it Miss?" Eve said, not lowering the rifle. "You can put that down. Ma'am, I bring news." Luke stepped out onto the porch behind her, leaning heavily on a cane he had whittled. "Let him speak." "Eve," Luke said. The marshal nodded to Luke. "Glad to see you upright. McKenna, heard you took a lead slug. I have had worse." Luke lied. The marshal smiled grimly. "Well, you will be pleased to know that Mr. Cade will not be shooting at anyone for a long time. We raided the Golden Garter 3 days ago, found the girls, found the books, found enough laudanum to put the whole territory to sleep." "And the sheriff?" Luke asked. "In a cell next to Cade," the marshal said, "awaiting transport to federal prison, corruption, trafficking, accessory to kidnapping. They are done." Eve felt a weight lift off her shoulders, so heavy she hadn't realized she was carrying it. It was over. The immediate threat, the man who had haunted her nightmares, was gone. "Justice is a slow wheel," the marshal added, shifting in his saddle. "Some of Cade's partners scattered west, and I will be honest with you folks. The town is stirred up. A lot of people are embarrassed they let it go on so long. Embarrassed people get angry. They might not be too friendly to you two for a while. We are used to that," Luke said. The marshal tipped his hat again. "Good luck to you." He rode away. The marshal was right. The letters started coming a week later. They were not threatening, exactly, but they were cold. The Ladies' Aid Society informed Luke that his donation of beef for the spring social would not be required this year. The bank sent a notice that while they would not foreclose immediately, they expected strict adherence to the payment schedule. The stigma of the fallen woman had not vanished just because Cade was in chains. One evening, as the sun was setting, painting the sky in bands of bruised purple and gold, Luke sat by the window. He was watching Eve mend a shirt. "Eve," he said quietly. She looked up. "Yes?" He hesitated, tracing the grain of the wood on his cane. "You know, now that Cade is gone, you are free, really free." "I know," she said. "If you wanted to leave, I would understand. There are towns in California or Oregon where no one knows your name. You could start over. You could teach piano. You could find a husband who does not have a mortgage and a bad reputation." Eve put the needle down. She stared at him. "Is that what you want? You want me to leave?" "No," Luke said, his voice cracking. "God, no. I want you here more than I want my next breath. But I do not want you to stay because you feel you owe me, or because you are afraid of the world. I want you to have a life that is not this hard." Eve stood up. She walked across the room. She stood before him, looking down at the scars on his face, the gray in his hair, the worry in his eyes. She saw the man who had bought her freedom, the man who had washed her face, the man who had nearly died for her. She sat carefully on the edge of his chair, resting her hand on his knee. "I do not want a quiet life. Luke," she said softly, "I do not want a life where I have to hide who I was." She took a breath. "I want the man who sat in the chair. I want the man who held me when I was shaking. I want the man who let me dig a bullet out of his shoulder and didn't scream at me." She leaned forward, her face inches from his. "Save me 3 times a day." "Luke," she whispered. Luke's eyes widened. I thought you didn't need that anymore." "I don't need saving from the laudanum," she said. And I don't need saving from Cade, but save me from forgetting what we went through. Save me from thinking I have to be perfect to be loved. And let me save you. Let me save you from the loneliness. Let me save you from the silence. Luke let out a shuddering breath. Tears welled in his eyes, spilling over to track through the stubble on his cheeks. You choose this? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. You choose me? Scarred, broke, and stubborn. Eve smiled. It was a true smile, one that reached her eyes. I choose you, she said. She leaned in and kissed him. It was not a desperate kiss through jail bars. It was not a fearful kiss on a ridge. It was slow. It was tender. It was a conversation without words. She poured all of it into that touch, the gratitude, the hunger, the fear, the hope. Luke dropped his cane. His good arm came up to wrap around her waist, pulling her closer. He kissed her back with a reverence that made her heart ache. The world outside, the judgmental town, the hard land, the uncertain future, faded away. The room narrowed down to the warmth of the fire and the steady, synchronized beating of their hearts. Can I? Luke pulled back slightly, his eyes searching hers. Yes, Eve whispered. Yes. They moved to the bedroom. The act was not a taking, but a giving. It was a shedding of the past. Every touch was a reassurance, every movement a promise kept. In the quiet of the winter-bound house, two wounded people found that their broken pieces fit together to make something whole. Spring came to the high plains with a violence of green. The mud dried, the creek filled with snowmelt, running clear and cold. The grass pushed up through the dead thatch, turning the endless gray hills into a sea of emerald. Luke and Eve worked side by side. They mended the fences that the winter had broken. They nursed the calves that had been born in the storms. They planted a garden near the house, potatoes, beans, and tough, resilient flowers. They rode into town together now. They walked down the street with their heads high. Mrs. Gable still crossed the street to avoid them, but the liveryman tipped his hat. And the new store clerk, Abernathy, had sold out and moved on, greeted them by name. One evening, they stood on the ridge overlooking the ranch. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the valley. I heard something today, Luke said, leaning on the saddle horn. The new preacher says there are 2 orphans left over from when the saloon closed down, a boy and a girl. Nobody knows what to do with them. Eve looked at him. She saw the question in his eyes. We have the room, she said. They are likely wild, Luke warned. Damaged. We know something about being damaged, Eve said. We know how to fix it. Luke smiled. He reached out and took her hand. His grip was strong, his shoulder healed, though it would always stiffen in the rain. 3 times a day? He asked. Morning, noon, and night, she answered. They stood there as the sun dipped below the horizon, embracing the fragile but fierce hope of the future. The west would never be gentle. The wind would always blow. The drought would always return. But as they turned their horses toward the light of the ranch house below, they knew that whatever came, they would face it together. Thank you for listening to this story of Luke and Eve. It is a tale about the hardest kinds of battles, the ones we fight inside ourselves, and the power of a love that refuses to give up. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Please leave a comment below and share your location. And if this story touched you, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more tales of the American frontier. I invite you to share your thoughts on the ending in English. Did Eve and Luke find the peace they deserved? Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon.